Greetings. This lecture is on decision-making biases. We've already introduced this topic sort of lightly when we were discussing different perceptual distortions that one might have in how we perceive things, and really what those distortions end up is a decision-making bias. Our brain is always looking for ways to simplify things. Our brain is always looking for ways to find the path of least resistance. And sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes oversimplifying can create problems for us. So the next slide, how did I fall for that? And really, we always feel like we can overcome biases or that we're immune to it because, well, we're smart or we're educated, and to be perfectly honest, just as we're fooled by optical illusions, we can be fooled by decision-making biases because, again, decision-making biases comes from the natural tendencies of our brain to try to make sense of the world. And so, will we all be subject to decision-making biases? Absolutely. Can we minimize that impact or avoid it? Minimize is probably really good. You can avoid some of the major pitfalls really by making sure we're training, bringing awareness to decision-making biases so that when we see them, it sets off a red flag for us, being more mindful in the way that we make decisions and really following our checklist, if you will, of the things that we're supposed to do. I love the checklist manifesto, and we will be listening to that in class. But the important thing around that checklist manifesto is, we have a checklist so we can avoid decision-making biases affecting us when we have very standardized, programmed decisions to make. What you're going to see as we start going through this material is that a lot of these biases overlap each other. And in fact, some biases then contribute to certain other biases in terms of outcomes. And for example, an overconfidence bias may result in us having what we think to be 20/20 vision about what happened in the past. But our judgments, of course, are flawed. So, we'll see how these things relate and overlap with each other as we move through each of the slides. The first slide of the biases that we'll be talking about is the overconfidence bias. And really what it comes down to is we have more confidence in our judgments than we should. We are actually very overconfident. And this is not uncommon because we always have a higher perception of ourselves and our abilities than perhaps others do. But this can be a problem when we're trying to convince somebody of something and in fact we're not completely sure this is going to work, although we have a high probability. Basically, if you say, I am 99% sure this is going to happen, or I'm 100% sure, I guarantee it, that's the first red flag you need to raise for yourself. Because when someone says they're absolutely 100% sure or 99% sure, the bottom line is they're overestimating what they're capable of doing. The more comfortable we are, the more knowledgeable we are, the more realistic our estimates are. So we tend then to think, well, I'm fairly certain, maybe 75% sure this will happen. There is always the possibility A, B, C, and D could happen, but we have a high probability of, X, Y, and Z occurring, so this is a good option for us. Again, when you're knowledgeable, you don't need to use hubris or your ego to try to convince somebody else of something. And the bottom line is, if you are knowledgeable about it, you let your knowledge lead the way. You let the knowledge convince the individual that this is going to work. And so that's why a lot of times we see good leaders are not necessarily leaders who have a position in the company, but good leaders are people who are knowledgeable and can direct people in an appropriate way, and they become a leader, a de facto leader. Even if they don't have a position power, they certainly have knowledge and power in that manner, which is kind of fun and interesting. So how does overconfidence bias happen? What's one of the primary reasons, or some of the primary reasons why it occurs? Well, first of all, we have this illusion, as I said, that we are much better than what we really are. This illusion of superiority that, oh, I'm educated, I'm smart, people look up to me, so therefore, I cannot make any mistakes. So I have to be superior, I have to be excellent, and I have to be perfect at what I do, so that sometimes that drive for perfection will drive people to be very overconfident in what they can do. The other thing that contributes to overconfidence is this belief that somehow you can manage random events. We can't predict random events. They're random for a reason, because they're random. You know, so anything could occur. Anything could, you know, throw a curveball into the process that you've designed, no matter how carefully you've designed it. There are many things we can't anticipate because, again, our brains are very limited in the data that we can process. Remember, 7 to 9 pieces of information is about all we can manage. So, you know, there may be a number of things out there that we can't even consider. So it's very important that we recognize that random is random. It is not something we can control. It's not something we can predict. Again, talked about the limited ability to know all the outcomes. The other one is seeking confirming evidence. Whenever we are looking to support our arguments, which then pushes us to lead with a lot of overconfidence, is that we look for confirming evidence and we don't look for disconfirming evidence. The more knowledgeable a person is, the more they recognize that there is confirming evidence and disconfirming evidence, that there are times when it works and times when it doesn't work, and you have to know that full range of what can occur in order for you to really feel knowledgeable about what a potential outcome may be. So a lot of times what we do as people is we look for evidence that supports our arguments, not disclaims our arguments. And so it's really important that we not only look for things that support us, but we also look for things that are going to shut our idea down. As much as that feels scary, if we can find things that may potentially shoot our idea down, and our idea is still strong, you know, then there's more confidence in our results. But if we are ignoring anything that could potentially shoot our idea down, then we're going to be in a lot more trouble. Lastly, it's very easy for us to remember all of our successes when we tend to forget failures. But as we all know, the greatest place where we can learn is through failure, not through success. Success just reinforces what we feel we already know. Failures and learning from failures is really where we can gain the most information to ensure we're more successful now and in the future. The next decision-making bias we'll discuss is the inertia bias. And we're already familiar with the inertia bias from listening to the Jonah Lehrer audio interview when he walked into the cereal aisle and he had, you know, paralysis by analysis. He spent so much time trying to gather information and felt so much pressure to make the perfect decision that he put off the decision because he was afraid to commit to a particular outcome. And so when we see that there may be a conflict in our choices, you know, when they're almost equally weighted, you know, it's very easy for us to get caught up in analyzing and trying to push back having to make a decision. Now, analyzers can fall victim to this pretty quickly, and so it's really important that you as analytical decision makers recognize that you can get caught in this inertia bias, that there comes a point when you have to pull the trigger, when you have to make a decision, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you've done a good job really situating out what are the most important factors and deciding how they're weighted, you know, relatively well, you should be able to overcome this particular bias. So we also sometimes engage in inertia bias when we feel something is kind of unpleasant, when we're really don't want to deal with the outcomes, or at least in the short term. Perhaps if the long-term gain is good, you know, we should make that decision, but sometimes you have to stumble through some challenges before you can get to the good stuff, you know, and a lot of times I think we see this in our own lives. You know, we may be in relationships with people who are, you know, not good for us, but we stick it out because the thought of breaking up is just so horrific. Or, you know, we break up with them, but the pain is so bad, we go back to them because we just don't know how to break free of that. Or, you know, again, you know, recognizing that we're going to have to make some really difficult changes in our company. We have a massive strategy change that we need to go through. It's going to shake our culture up tremendously. And so it's really easy to turn around and go, let's find another strategy, rather than saying, look, this is going to be really ugly for now, but in the long run, this is better for us. And this is, again, kind of what IBM faced. There was enormous unpleasantness, having to change the culture, change the way they do things, and yet, in the end, it was a good thing for them to do. They really had to just buckle down and push through the pain and the unpleasantness in order to get to that other side. So inertia is about avoidance, either avoidance of conflict or avoidance of unpleasantness. But either way, it's about avoiding things. We don't want to make the decision, or we don't feel like we're ready to make that decision yet. Immediate gratification bias is the opposite side of the same problem we have with inertia bias. Whereas inertia bias, we are resistant to acting, or resistant to making the decision. Immediate gratification is the opposite of that, and we're so ready to jump in, we may actually jump in way too soon, which can be a very, very big problem. And certainly we see Wall Street is engaged in this sort of activity, this whole quarteritis idea of quarterly earnings and how important this quarter's earnings are. When we realize it's a ridiculous notion that, the long term really needs to be our focus, not just these short-term quarter fluctuations. When we're caught in that, that's very problematic for us. So immediate gratification means that we don't want to postpone any kind of pleasure, or we don't want to postpone, whatever the perceived reward is. We want to jump in right away. It tends to be a very short-term focus. We don't really think about the long-term implications of what we do. And we don't have a sense of what it is that we want to see in the future, because we're not even thinking of the future. We're only thinking right here and right now. The thing is with mindfulness, even though mindfulness says we have to be in the present, mindfulness is also about understanding the impact that our actions have on those that come after us, or on our future, whatever that might be. So bringing mindfulness grounds us in the moment, but it enables us to think more broadly than just, oh, what I need right now, and so therefore I'm going to go and I'm going to grab it right away, and I don't care what the implications are for the long-term issue. You think about Bausch and Lomb and what Bausch and Lomb did in terms of, they needed to, they overstated their earnings a number of years ago because there was so much pressure on them or perceived pressure to increase this growth that they had. And so with this pressure to increase this growth, they had this very short-term focus. We need to grow every year. It's really important. It's really important. And in the end, they overstated their earnings to make it look like they were more successful than they were, and it had long-term negative ramifications for Bausch and Lomb. A, as a good company and one that people could trust, and B, as a good investment. So our goal with immediate gratification is taking a moment and stopping and breathing and centering ourselves, and then thinking, does this have to be done now? What is the implication of by doing this, will there be a long-term concern or issue that I have? So that's the things we need to focus on. Anchoring biases are a challenge for us because a lot of times when someone gives us some information, we're anchored to that piece of information, and it's very hard for us to break free from that, to think, could there be an alternative solution besides the parameters that you gave us? So you might say, hey, I'm interested in this, and so here's an idea, and because I throw the idea at you as opposed to allowing you to do the brainstorming, you're anchored to the idea that I threw out at you, and then we don't investigate any other possible alternatives out there. So we need to keep in mind that if someone's providing information for us or providing something to us, that the primacy effect, right, the first thing that comes to us is one that is prone to huge biases. We get anchored to that initial idea and find it really hard to break free. It's like, when I was talking about the moonwalking bear solution, if I say to you, here's your choices, it's A or B, and this is what you need to do, I'm anchoring you and looking at the team in white who is throwing the ball and how many times they pass it, that you're anchored to that as, well, that's the only thing that I need to worry about in this video, and realize there's more to it. So what you're looking for is being able to step outside of that initial idea, and it might be a good idea, but it doesn't. We want to be careful that we're not throwing away other ideas or not exploring other paths just because we got stuck in this one place first. Sometimes people will do that to us purposefully. They'll anchor us to this idea, and we feel like, well, that sounds like a great idea. We satisfy, we simplify. It's the easiest thing to do, so we stick with that initial idea as opposed to really exploring what might be more optimal. The effect is the most prevalent, as it says there, when there's a lack of objective information to compare it against. And I like to use the idea of thinking about how does one value, or how did one value, a credit default swap. You know, when it came to those instruments used during the whole mortgage debacle in the late 2008, 9, 10 time. People will tell you that they could not, for the life of them, figure out how to value a credit default swap. So someone said, hey, how about X? And that's what stuck. It wasn't because there was any value to what a credit default swap was worth. It doesn't have any inherent value. Someone assigned a value, you know, independent of, you know, anything other than what they thought it might be worth. And that's the thing that started to be the downfall. If it doesn't have any inherent value and you're fixated on this idea, you know, you don't question whether or not the idea is actually good. You start to just go along with the flow. Right? We want to be also careful when we're in very ambiguous situations. Trivial information can get tossed at us, and that's the stuff that we may anchor to. So again, think about an anchor as this heavy anchor weighing around your head, and you're sort of stuck, you know, at this idea or this place or this thing, and we can't, and we have it very difficult for us to move away from that idea. So when it's very ambiguous, don't assume that the trivial information is always the most valuable stuff. You need to really take your time, even in a crisis, to explore and not get stuck just looking at the trivia. There may be other things out there that we need to pay attention to.